Good morning. Once again, I want to welcome everyone, as we've already done, but say that I hope you've had a good week. It is good, as always, to be able to see brothers in Christ together, to come together to worship the Lord as God has intended for us to do, and to do that in a way that is scriptural, and again, thankful to live in a place where we can do that without fear and safety for our lives. To any visitors that we have here this morning, I want you to know that you are always our honored guest, and invite you to be with us any chance you may get. Anyone who might be watching us on the live stream or watching this later on, again, thank you for joining us this morning. There is a story in the Bible that has always been fascinating to me, and for some reason, over the last 6 or 7 years, or 8 years rather, that I've been doing lessons and preaching. I don't think they've ever really done a lesson specifically on this topic. And I think that maybe there was something said in the invitation a couple of weeks ago that kind of sparked my memory on this. And so I started diving deeper into this topic. And we're actually going to do a two-part lesson today based off this story. And we're looking at the story of Uzzah and the ark. Go ahead and turn to 2 Samuel chapter 6, if you will. We're going to be spending our time this morning looking at the first several verses of this chapter. The story of Uzzah is one that we probably all know, but there are several lessons that we can take away from this. And this morning, we're going to be really focused on the first 8 or 9 verses of this story. And looking at what happens to Uzzah, we're going to analyze, what did Uzzah do? What led to his death? Why did he die? And then finally looking at David's reaction to that death in itself. Now, we're going to be focused primarily in 2 Samuel chapter 6. The First Chronicles chapter 13, I believe it is, also tells this story. And as we look at First Chronicles 13, looking at the first couple of verses, we see the setting up of what's happening here. We see that King David has come into power. And my understanding here is that this is the early years of David's reign over Israel. And he is seeking to bring the Ark of the Covenant to his new city of Jerusalem. The Ark had not really been in the possession of the Israelites for many years and had been given back, but again, had not really presided in Jerusalem. And so as the king of Israel, David is going to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the new capital of the Israelites. And that's what sets up the whole storyline of where this begins. So let's go ahead and start with the first 5 verses here and look at what happens here as we now have that background information. It says, now David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David departed from Baal Judah with all the people who were with him to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name, the very name of the Lord of armies, who is enthroned above the cherubim. They had mounted the ark of God on a new cart and moved it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new cart. So they brought it with the ark. So they brought it with the ark of God from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Ahio was walking ahead of the ark. Meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with all kinds of instruments made of juniper wood, with lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. So we see here that David is going to get the ark from where it was, and he is going to bring it to Jerusalem. Now, again, we really have no idea of any kind of background on Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab. We really had no other information outside of the fact that these 2 men were put in charge of kind of guiding the ark. So the ark had been in possession of these men all this time. And what they do is that they place the ark on a cart that is led by oxen. And by using that method, they're going to carry the ark back to Jerusalem. So that's what's going on here. And behind that cart, or at least around anyway, is going to be David and these men. Again, going back to verse 1, 30,000 men of Israel to bring the ark back to Jerusalem, or to Jerusalem, to be its place among the people of the Israelites. But as we look into verse 6, we see that something happens on the way. Verse 6 is really the kind of the peak of the storyline here. It says, but when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it, because the oxen nearly overturned it. And the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God. So again, you've got these men, and again, you got two in particular who are walking with the cart itself. Who are making sure that the ark stays on the cart, nothing happens to it. And what happens here is it says in verse 6, it says that the oxen nearly overturned it. So the oxen did something, the ark shifted and was going to fall, and Uzzah reached out to stop the ark of the covenant from falling. Probably a normal reaction that probably anybody would have. You see something falling, especially something important as the ark of the covenant, and you're going to reach out and make sure that nothing happens to it. But what happens to Uzzah? In verse 7 it says, the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God. So the first question that we always see here is that Uzzah was trying to save the ark. Again, a very important artifact here, not just an artifact, but again, you're talking about the days of the old law where the ark of the covenant was very, very important. So why did God kill him? Why did God kill Uzzah if he has such good intentions of trying to save and protect the ark of the covenant? Well, there are a couple of things here to keep in mind. And even as Christians, we can look at this and say, well, he had good intentions. He was trying to do the right thing. And I've heard unbelievers say before in that God was just being unjust here. Uzzah was trying to do a good thing, and God struck him down dead. Well, if we take a look back at Numbers chapter 1, verses 47 through 54, we're not going to turn there right now. But you're going back at the instructions given to Moses of the old law. And the instructions here that when it came to the matters of the temple, especially in regards to the Ark of the Covenant, that only Levites were to handle those things. Members of the tribe of Levi. And so when it came to touching the Ark, and dealing with the ark, only members of the tribe of Levi were allowed to do that. Well, the problem here is that Uzzah was more than likely from the tribe of Judah. I don't know if that's never necessarily been proven 100%, but Uzzah definitely was not a Levite. And so what we see here is that part of the law has been broken. God had given specific instructions to Moses, back in Numbers chapter 1, as to the proper handling of the temple, the artifacts of the temple, and that included the Ark of the Covenant, as to who was to touch it, as to who was to do these certain things. And so what's happened here is that Uzzah has gone against the old law. Uzzah has gone against those instructions of God, in that because he was not a Levite, yes, he was trying to save it, yes, he was trying to protect it. But again, God had given specific instructions as to who was to handle and who is to touch the ark. As we go back and look at the other instructions given, we see that the ark being placed on the cart itself was also not something that God had really given permission to do. As the ark was created, you had the 4 rings on the corners, and you had the 2 poles go through those 4 rings, and that's how the ark was supposed to be transported. So what's happened here is that the ark has been mishandled in a way that has gone against the law that God had given. God had given specific instructions years earlier, but those instructions were still in hold at this point in time. So what's happened here is that really they had mishandled the ark. They'd gone against the will of God. And as a result of that, Uzzah was killed because he went against the commands of God. Now, we can still sit here and say, well, yeah, but that's a pretty extreme punishment, and that Uzzah died right there on the spot. We're going to come back to that mindset here in a few minutes and look at whether or not this killing was justified. And again, looking at the whole purpose of what this was, we know that immediately the purpose was the mishandling of the ark. We know that the immediate purpose here was because Uzzah had gone against God's law and God's wishes. But there's something deeper here that we also need to make sure that we look at. And again, we'll get into that towards the end of the lesson. As we continue on in the passage here, we see that Uzzah is struck dead in verse 7 because it says because of his irreverence. Again, because of his mishandling, because of the attitude that they had at that point in time in regards to the ark. If we look at the next verse here, verse 8, It says, then David became angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah. And that place has been called Perez Uzzah to this day. So what we see here is that Uzzah has been struck down dead. And it says that David was angry at that. David is angry because Uzzah is killed. Now, why was David angry? Again, we know why he was killed. Was his anger towards God? Was David angry at God for striking down Uzzah? I've read several commentaries leading up to this. I don't know if we really have a specific answer for this. But there are a couple of different theories in that either David was mad at God for striking down Uzzah, or that maybe David, again, being a new leader and trying to do things such as bring the Ark, the covenant to Jerusalem, he's done this with a big celebration, and then out of all that, here comes the death of Uzzah. And this massive, I don't want to use the phrase, but it kind of goes in context here, this major buzzkill, almost to speak. And what's happened here? And so whether or not David's anger was against God specifically or just at the certain situation, we see that David is angered here. And again, it says anger to the point to where he called the place Perez Uzzah in regards to honoring Uzzah himself. Regardless, it appears to me that David's kind of missed the point of what's going on here. Whether that anger is at God specifically or at the situation, David's not quite understanding here. I asked the question here, was his anger justified? And again, we're going to come back to that as we look at the main points of the lesson. But again, many people will look at this, many regular people will say, well, yeah, Uzzah was killed. The reaction by God was extreme. And yeah, of course, David would be angry, as would many other people. But again, David's really missing the point here, but he soon realizes that point, or at least part of it, with the next verse. In verse 9, it says, so David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? And David was unwilling to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David with him. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. So we see here that David's anger quickly turns into fear. All right? Why? What led to a change of David's attitude? David's so fearful that he's afraid to move the ark, period. Again, they had this massive celebration of moving the ark to Jerusalem, moving it to the new home of the Israelites that for many, many years had been in the hands of the Philistines. This was a great moment. This was a great celebration. And yet David is fearful because of what happened to Uzzah. David realizes, first of all, the power of God. And David is fearful. He asks the question here, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? How can we transport the ark? I'm so afraid that something like this is going to happen again, that I'm just going to park it. I'm going to keep it in this house, and we're going to keep it here until I figure out how to do this. Again, David's a little frustrated here. But David at least understands that he should be a little fearful because of how the situation has been handled and because of the power of God. So, in asking all these questions, why does David anger turn to fear? Why did God kill Uzzah? Why was David anger justified? All right, so out of these 11 verses here, we've got 3 main points to take away from this story. Number 1, God killed Uzzah because he disobeyed. No matter how you look at it, no matter how we try to justify it, and again, human nature is to say, yeah, but he was trying to do the right thing. Yeah, but he had good intentions. There is no yeah, but here. The fact is that God gave instructions, and those instructions were violent. God had given the instructions to Moses back at the very beginning of the law. And again, there were 2 things broken here in how the ark was being carried or transported, and the fact that Uzzah touched the ark not being allowed to. Again, they messed up. So was the killing against Uzzah, was it justified? Probably so, because again, those were specific commandments given by God. As we go back to Exodus chapter 19, Moses went to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, this is what you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. Again, further instructions given to Moses by God at the institution of the law. He says, see what I did to the Egyptians, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. God said, if you keep my commandments, if you keep my covenant, if all these instructions, and there's a whole lot of them, if you do these things, then here's the glory that you will have. But again, God gave specific instructions. Have you ever tried to read the first few books of the Bible? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. It's a hard read. Because a lot of that are just specific instructions in regards to how to build a tabernacle and how to conduct the burnt offerings. And again, the construction of the ark and the handling of the ark. There's a lot of very detailed information about all those things in the institution of the law. Why is there so much information in the Bible about that? Can't you just kind of skip over and kind of trust that, well, here's God's instructions? It's in there because it's that important. And those instructions were so detailed because that's what God wanted. That's what God willed. That's what God told that I want you to do. And if you do these things, then glory is waiting for you. But if you don't do those things, then what happened to us is going to happen. Again, those instructions have been given to the Israelites back on day one. Back when God gave the information to Moses himself. So was Uzzah's killing justified? Absolutely. God gave instructions. Those instructions were broken. And so the punishment by God is whatever he willed. And who are we to question it? So yeah, Uzzah messed up. David messed up. They disobeyed God. And that's the main point that we see here. And that you disobeyed God. And you can't expect to have grace and mercy. Number two, we have to follow God's will at all costs. Now, again, you're looking at transporting the ark, which no doubt would not have been light. And so, again, David's trying to figure out how to transport it from one place to another. My understanding here from this whole storyline is that he got the idea of carrying it by the cart from the Philistines who had taken over for many years. Again, instead of following the direct instructions from God, again, David kind of took the ideas of what man had done, and that's what led to this whole situation. And so his desire to bring it to Jerusalem, I don't think there's anything wrong with that because we don't see anything wrong with that. But again, it's the manner and how it's done. There is a right way to do it. And so as a result of that, we have to make sure that we follow God's will at all costs. Because if we don't, we saw the kind of power that God has. We see the kind of patience that God has when we don't obey him. So if we don't want to end up like Uzzah, we got to make sure that we follow God and his instructions no matter what. And for this, I always go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 29, where Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand is causing you to sin, cut it off and throw it away from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, whether you want to take this literally or figuratively, the point that Jesus is making here is that do whatever you need to stay away from sin. And yes, this is an extreme example. And I've said before that I think that we need to make sure that we follow this as close as possible, no matter what. And again, we see what happened to Uzzah. We see what happened to so many who disobeyed God through the years. So many examples in the Old and New Testament. In that it is that important. It is that vital. That we stay faithful to God. And that we obey God at all costs. Because we know what God is capable of. We know that God can strike down any man at any point in time. Like he reminded Moses, I struck down the Egyptians. The entire Egyptian army died in the Red Sea. That's the power of God. That's the will of God. And that's the wrath of God. And that we see what God can and will do. So we have to make sure that like David finally realized there, we should be fearful of the wrath of God. We should be fearful at what can happen when we're not faithful to God, when we disobey God. And if we leave this earth a sinner, what will happen to us? And that brings us to my third and final point for this morning. We have to understand the seriousness, not seriously, the seriousness of God's wrath. And to me, that's what this whole story boils down to, is understanding the wrath of God, understanding the instructions of God. And when we don't do what God commands for us to do, then God's wrath can and will rain down on us. That's exactly what happened to Uzzah. Uzzah did not follow the instructions that were clearly given. Uzzah, whether it was ignoring it or not knowing or whatever it was, I have a hard time believing they didn't know about it. And King David as well, they knew better. They should have known better. And as a result of that, we see what happens here. We have to make sure that we understand the same things that David did after this. And that God's wrath is serious. God's wrath can destroy armies. It can destroy nations. And at some point in time, it's going to destroy this entire world. God made this world. He's going to take it out. And we have to make sure that we always understand it. And again, I look at the words of Jesus, where he says in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way that is broad that leads to destruction. And there are many who enter through it. For the gate is narrow and the way is constricted that leads to life, and there are few who find it. There are several occasions that Jesus talks about heaven and who will enter heaven and who will not enter heaven. We look at the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, the 10 virgins. Of 5 were there, their oils were well lit, they were prepared. So when the bridegroom came, they entered into the celebration, and the 5 that were not prepared, they had to go back to get more oil, and when they came back, the doors were already closed. The ceremony was already going, and the words were said to them, depart from me, I never knew you. That parable is talking about those who are prepared and not prepared for heaven. And those who are not prepared, those who do not do the will of God, will see the wrath of God. Jesus says that there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What we see here by Jesus' descriptions here is that we can always assume that, yes, this means people who are unbelievers, people who are atheists, people who worship other religions. But Jesus says here, or says in several occasions, there are those who think that they'll go to heaven, but they're not going to. What he's talking about here are people who think that they're faithful to God. When people say, we prophesied in your name, we did these things in your name, but yet God still says, depart from me, I never knew you. Those are people who worship God. So what we see here is that we've got to make sure that we follow God at all costs. Mark kind of mentioned this morning in the Lord's Supper, not necessarily directly, but looking at comparing how we're supposed to be during this worship service, how we're supposed to be during the Lord's Supper. And again, we're supposed to have a reverent attitude, coming together to worship God and to praise God. And that's what we sing, is sing with the hearts, but always having the mindset of we're here for one purpose, and that is to worship and to praise God. And yet we see so many today to where it is almost more like a party. It's almost more like a concert. It's almost more like a good old time. And again, you're praising God, is fine, but do it in the right way. I think there are a lot of great intentions by people around us today. But again, Uzzah had great intentions himself. Are those good intentions or are those God's instructions? And that's a message for us here as well. Are we following God the way that we need to be? Are we following God's instructions when it comes to worship, when it comes to serving, when it comes to living my own life? Or do I have those good intentions, but I'm falling well short of what God tells me to do? We hear a whole lot today by these different denominations of how good God is and God's grace and God loves you. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, God loves you, it's going to be okay. And you know what? They're right. God does love us. God does show mercy. God is a gracious God, no doubt about it. None of us ever deserve to go to heaven, but yet some will. Jesus gave his own life. Jesus was merciful towards us in suffering that cruel death. But make no mistake about it that God is also a God to be feared. God is also a God that will punish and destroy and desecrate. And that's also a very important lesson that we also have to make sure we keep in our minds. It's fine to talk about the glory of God and the grace of God and the mercy of God because, yes, that's all true. But don't forget what happened here with Uzzah. Don't forget what happens to those who disobey God. Don't forget what happened to those who had good intentions but fell short of God's instructions. Because make no mistake about it, the wrath of God will reign. It has before and it will again. And when Jesus comes back, he's going to destroy this world. And at that point in time, the judgment's going to come. And again, Jesus gives us several glimpses as to how that judgment's going to go. There are people who think they're going to heaven, but they're not going to. We have no idea who that's going to be. That's up to him. But don't forget that we can find ourselves on the wrong side of that very easily. Again, any human being can look at the story of Uzzah and say, Uzzah was just trying to do what he thought was right. Uzzah was just trying to help. He was just trying to do the right thing. But again, he disobeyed God. And when we disobey God, we have to understand that even good intentions can have bad results. There's a reason that we see over and over in Proverbs that there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is destruction. That's why I have to make sure that we follow God's words and God's words only. Have there been times in your life where you thought you did the right thing, you had good intentions, but the bad result happened as a result of it? There's a reason we have to make sure that we put our trust and faith in God. And so this very short story really comprises of 3 verses. We see such an important lesson here. And what happens when we don't obey God. When we disobey God and Jesus, when we're not faithful as we need to be, and again, even some of the most minute details, God is paying attention to. So as we close out the lesson this morning, we went off with the invitation and analyze, am I doing what God has told me to do? Am I living the life in the way that God has told me to? Or am I living my life in the way that I think is right? And again, we see that all the time around us. That's nothing new. It's been there since the beginning of time. People have done what they thought was right, and it goes against the will of God. And that's been going on for thousands of years. But we are seeing a whole lot of that around us today. And that new churches are popping up. And again, they may think that they're doing the right thing, but the question is, are you following God's instructions? And again, we're not exempt from that. Are we following God's instructions? God has given us a law. He's given us a book. He's given us a blueprint. And he expects us to follow that. And when we don't, then it's our own fault. It was Uzzah's own fault. It was David's own fault. And that's also a important thing to keep in mind. It's great to talk about the grace and mercy of God because, yes, that's true, but never also forget God's punishment and God's wrath. And when we don't follow God, God will punish. And the same fear that David had in verse 9 is the same fear that we need to have every single day. Not a fear to stay away from God, but a fear that I better do what he tells me to because here's what can happen. And that may be hard sometimes, but think about how hard it's going to be on the day of judgment. And think back to the words of Jesus and to hear the words, "Depart from me, I never knew you." And then ask the question, was it worth it? Was it worth to live our life, or is it worth it to live the life that God tells us to? And that's what it comes down to. So this morning, if there's anyone who has any doubt in your mind as to whether you're living the life that God has told you to do, whether you found yourself at times disobeying God, whether you meant to or not, maybe you've done so in a way to where you feel like you got to come forward to get forgiveness of those sins, or to get prayers from the church to help get you back on the right track. Maybe you need prayers from the church to help you get through a certain situation. Or maybe there's just somebody here this morning who needs to become a Christian. Again, those instructions are very clear in how we become a Christian. And if we don't follow those instructions, then we can't expect to be with God in heaven. So this morning, if there's any doubt in your mind, don't end up like Uzzah. Make sure that we end up like Paul and Peter and all those great examples that we read about. So I have no doubt in my mind will be with God and Jesus in heaven. That's where I want to be. So if we can help in any way, please come as we stand as we sing.